When the celebrated artist Peter Lely set out to paint the portrait of Oliver Cromwell, Cromwell famously said to him, "Paint me warts and all." And that's what Sir Peter did, and he had some humdingers. What I love about the Bible is that it's so honest. It paints David warts and all, and he had some humdingers. He never disintegrated completely like Saul. He was never rejected by God, but he failed in some very important areas. And I want to ask why. We saw when we looked at Samuel that most people fall because of money, sex, power, or prestige. And Saul fell because of power. He became a megalomaniac. What do you think was David's besetting sin? Now, it's very easy, because of his affair with Bathsheba, to say that it was sex, or as the seven deadly sins called it, lust. But I don't think so. He only ever had an affair once. But he had another fault that he repeated many times, his besetting sin. And in the old list, it was called sloth, which means laziness. Now you look at David and say, surely not. He was proactive, went out and fought Goliath, fought all his enemies, set up his kingdom wonderfully. That's quite true. He wasn't lazy there, but where he was lazy was in his personal life. He had a tendency to put off doing things that needed to be done. He had the sin of procrastination. His sins were sins of omission. And I want to try to show you this from two stories, the story of David and Bathsheba and the story of David and Absalom. These take up 40% of the book of 2 Samuel. Let's begin with Bathsheba. It all began one spring. At the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the army, but David stayed in Jerusalem. That was his first sin of omission. He didn't go out with his army. And it all developed from there. One evening, David got up from his bed, and from the roof he saw Bathsheba bathing. One evening, it had to be early evening, because he could still see Bathsheba. What's he doing in bed in the late afternoon? And there he's allowing the laziness to creep in, and everything follows. All I want to say about this story is that up to this time, everything David did met with success. After this time, everything David did led to difficulty. God forgave him, but the consequences continued. Now onto the story of David and Absalom, a much longer story. It all begins with Amnon, son of David, when he fell in love with Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, son of David. Now, they were all David's children, but Absalom and Tamar had the same mother. Amnon was their half-brother. He raped Tamar. Now, that's a capital offense requiring action from David. And we read that when David heard all this, he was furious. Now, that's fine. Furious is good, isn't it? But the next verse we read, 2 years later, David has done nothing. If it had been anyone else, he would have condemned them to death. But because it's his son, he does nothing. They say of parenting, it must be a good balance between nurture and discipline. With David, it's all nurture, and he ruins his children. Well, what happened 2 years later? Absalom set up a feast, but it was a trap. And Absalom ordered his men to strike Amnon down. So Absalom's men did. Now David has two problems. One son committed rape. The other has now committed either murder or revenge. The one is a capital offense, the other isn't. David needs to make a ruling. But we read, King David mourned many days for Ammon. Now that's fair enough, he is his son, but he is a rapist. And note the many days, and he does nothing. And so Absalom fled and went to the king of Geshur, and he stayed there 3 years. This is now 5 years since the initial event. And all we read is that David longed to go to Absalom, but he didn't go. David did nothing. And then for the second time in his life, a wise woman comes to David, and she says, "Why has the king not brought back his banished son? That is not what God desires. God devises ways so that a banished person does not remain banished from him." That last sentence, it's as good a description of the grace of God as you can find. And hidden in it is the prophecy of the cross of Jesus, the way that God devised. And so for the second time in his life, David listens to a wise woman. And he says to Joab, "Very well, I will do it. Go, bring back the young man Absalom to Jerusalem. Finally, David does something. It's not very much, and notice that he doesn't do it himself. But the next thing we read is, Absalom lived 2 full years in Jerusalem without seeing the king's face. David does nothing to resolve the problem. Well, Absalom doesn't waste those 2 years. We read that of all the men in Israel, there was no one so highly praised for his handsome good looks as Absalom. And he used to sit in the city gate and give judgment on people, and then he would say, if only I were the judge of Israel. He's preparing to take over his father's position. And then the chilling words, Absalom stole the hearts of the people of Israel. There's major trouble brewing for David. But David is too afraid of conflict, especially conflict with his own family. So he does nothing. In the next verse we read, after 4 years. This is now 11 years and he's resolved nothing in his family. Well, what happened after those 4 years? Well, Absalom said to the king, let me go to Hebron and fulfill a vow I've made to the Lord. That was a lie. He wasn't going to fulfill any vow. He was going to plan treason. And that's exactly what he did. Absalom sent messengers secretly all over the land saying, when you hear the trumpet, proclaim Absalom is king. That's high treason. Now, if that had been the Philistines coming up to kick David out of Jerusalem, he would have gone out and met them. But because it's his own son, David said to all his officials who were with him in Jerusalem, come, we must flee. He does nothing. And he leaves Jerusalem undefended for Absalom to take it. And David skulks down to the Dead Sea Valley and across the Jordan River, and there he hides. And so Absalom comes into Jerusalem, sets himself up in the palace as king, and he had 2 advisors. One was Ahithophel. Ahithophel said, send some men down to the Jordan River by night to kill David, and then you'll be king. But Hushai said, no, fight him man to man, take your army, fight his army, and then you'll legitimately be king of Israel. Well, Absalom rejected the advice of Ahithophel, and that put Ahithophel in a terrible position. Now he's committed treason, he sided with Absalom, but Absalom has rejected his advice. And so one of the saddest verses in the Bible, Ahithophel saddled his donkey, went to his hometown, set his house in order, and hanged himself. It's what today we call collateral damage. And Absalom took the advice of Hushai, and he took his army, and Absalom crossed the Jordan River with all his men. That was an act of war. And now in chapter 18, verse 3, David sent out his troops. He finally takes action, but only because he's forced to. Well, as it happens, David's army is victorious. They defeat the army of Absalom, and Absalom himself is killed, bizarrely, hanging by his hair from an oak tree. And when David hears the news, he went up to his room and wept and said in some of the most famous grief words in history, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." Meanwhile, his army, which had been victorious, when they heard it said the king is grieving for his son, the men stole into the city as men who are ashamed. His army is losing morale because of him. And what does he do? He carries on. He covered his face and cried aloud, "Oh, Absalom, Absalom, my son, my son." He does nothing. Eventually, Joab takes him by the arm and virtually forces him to the street to confront his troops. And so we come to the end of a long, sordid story. And the incredible thing is that God forgives it all. That sticks in our throat a little, doesn't it? David got away with adultery and murder. Yes, he did. God devised a way. But before we get too judgmental, we must remember what Jesus said, that if you've only looked at a woman, you've committed adultery. If you've only wished harm on someone else, you've committed murder. And he really meant it. And if anyone is feeling that God can never forgive them, they only have to look at David. A murderer, an adulterer, a very poor parent, and yet God had mercy.